Great. I'm going to whisper the entire class. Hey, Anita. Hey, Anita. All right, we're in Micah this morning. How far did we get? It's been 2 weeks. No excuse. We're in Micah, right? For sure in Micah. I know that much. Chapter 5? No way. No way. All right, we're going to start verse 6. Sound good? Chapter 1. There's no way we made it past that. Okay. Verse 1, I guess. Here we go. So, again, Micah talking to the southern tribes of Judah, the southern kingdom, because the north will be taken away captive when Micah is doing his ministry work here. The message is still the same from what it was in the book of Amos and Hosea. The idea. Let me back this guy down a little bit. Hey, Mac, can you turn the mic here down just a tad? That's better. Okay. Maybe a little bit more up. Okay. Test. Perfect. Okay. So, book of Micah, prophet to the southern tribes of Israel. The north will be taken away captive while he's doing his ministry work. Again, the whole thing about this time period before we transition towards captivity is that the nations are doing well on the outside. They're being blessed by God. They have abundance of wealth. They have no shortage of food. And yet, spiritually, we're in the book of Micah, chapter 1, verse 1. Good? Okay. And so, surface level, things are going really well. Underneath the surface, we have a problem with the spirituality of the nation of Israel. They're forgetting about Jehovah God and Him alone. They have other places to worship idols, other gods in the pantheon of the Canaanites around them. And the Lord is really trying to wake them up to the reality that what they're doing spiritually is not what He would desire for His people in Israel. We look about this, and the spiritual application for us is that whenever you look at the nation of Israel, what you're looking at is a microcosm. What's a microcosm? Not everybody all at once. Small sample. Say it again. Small part of something, right? You're looking for a narrative, a story that kind of encapsulates something larger, right? A parable, like the kingdom of heaven is likened to a man who a sower went forth to sow, right? And as he was sowing his seed into the ground, 4 different types of results took place. And we have all of those spiritual principles from that parable. That's one microcosm. One way to look at the kingdom of God, the church, is that we are the sowers sowing the seed, the word of God, and different hearts are affected by the word in different ways. That's a microcosm, a small individual picture of something that's much bigger in spiritual realm. So Israel itself is a microcosm for the church. So we're wondering, why do we need to know about the Old Testament? Well, because we're given the best example of what the church is going to run into when it comes to spiritual issues from God's perspective by looking at the physical nation of Israel. So, for example, they had a problem with idols in Israel during this time period in the book of Micah, right? So the church may have a problem running into idols. What can be idols for the church now and here in this day and age? Okay, anything in the place of God. Everything could be an idol when you put it in front of God, right? I wouldn't even mention football. I wouldn't even dare broach that subject. Never would I ever talk about sports being maybe in your heart and in your mind and in your time and in your expenses more important than God's work, right? I would never bring that up. Especially college football. I mean, why do you guys even care? They're little kids playing football. Who cares? It's not NFL, it doesn't matter. Now, if you're talking about Redskins and Cowboys, it's a whole other subject where I grew up. That's the one? Okay. What are they called now? Washington football team? It's the Redskins. It's the Redskins. I mean, they're not good, but they're still the Redskins. Okay. Verse 1. Thank you, Lisa. I wanted to give that small intro because I can get lost in the weeds sometimes. I mean, I can chase a rabbit down a rabbit hole and just keep going, and then I get 3-4 weeks into a study, and I forget why I'm even there to begin with. I mean, maybe you're better than me when it comes to that, more on point. But for me, if you're reading a minor prophet, it becomes the same thing. Like, what's the point of doing a class like this? Well, the point is, this was a severe spiritual problem with Israel. And learning from their examples, learning from their mistakes, we know what the pitfalls are. So, for example, one more kind of illustration here. When things are looking good on the surface, but there is spiritual decay underneath, sometimes it takes the words of the prophets to wake someone up to that reality. You're all here on a Sunday morning, you're wearing nice clothing, you probably drove a nice car to get here, things seem to be pretty good, but underneath in your spiritual life, you know what's going on in your world. You know what's happening. It may not be as nice as it looks on the surface, right? So when it comes to Israel being woken up to the reality of where they were spiritually, this is why this book's so important. So, okay, chapter 1, verse 1 is the introduction. The only thing that I want to bring out from here, like I brought up last time, was the idea that Hezekiah is going to be a king. I have mixed feelings about Hezekiah. If you know the history of who he was, he had some growing pains, you might say, but he was considered a good king. He was the king that was there when Assyria came and circled around the entire city of Jerusalem. They thought they were all going to die, as you do, and then they woke up and the angel of the Lord had gone through and killed all the troops that were encamped around the outside of Jerusalem. God gave them a reprieve, a chance to continue on and learn from that mistake. So here's verse 2. Hear you peoples, all of you, pay attention, O earth, and all that is in it, and let the Lord be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. So where's the Lord residing, I suppose, in this context? In the holy temple. Where was that? Jerusalem. All right. It's important to kind of recognize that because God is seen in the heavens, meaning above the earth is the Jewish image of that. And then also his dwelling place, his place of judgment or seatment would be on the Ark of the Covenant within the most holy place of the temple, right? So he's also in the heavens, he's also among the people like he always wanted to be. For behold, verse 3, the Lord is coming out of his place and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. Okay, so we see the imagery here of the Lord's movement. No longer will he just be in the heavens, he's now coming down to earth. So what kind of language, what kind of literature is this then if we're talking about this kind of dynamic? Clara's turn? I thought that was Lynn. Is that not Lynn? Do I have a chorus going on over there? When I sneeze. Yeah. How dare you call out the wrong person for sneezing? If it were Doug, I'd know it immediately. Where's Doug? He left already? Man, can't make fun of him. He's not here.
Not only from the heaven that he's residing now, he starts to reside among his people in the earth, he says.
Right, he does. That was always his desire, right? I will be their God, they will be my people. And yet because of the spiritual decay among the people, he can't live there anymore, so he's going to make his presence known. This kind of language of I will tread upon the high places of the earth, we've now transitioned to symbolic or apocalyptic language, meaning he's unveiling the spiritual nature of what's happening in that realm. So he's giving language here that's very poetic, very hyperbolic, very exaggerated to kind of get his point across. Verse 4, the mountains will melt under him. Is that literal? How do you melt a mountain? Well, God could, yeah, okay. But how do you do it? I mean, the heat, I suppose. You just melt the stone and the rock and the dirt that's there. I mean, don't throw in this scientific volcano nonsense here. We're talking about symbolic literature language here. So we're talking about the idea of, can the mountains melt without a volcano? No. The Lord's coming, He's going to melt the mountains, the things that have been around for generations, the things that you tell your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandkids about. These mountains have been here forever. The Lord's going to bring them down to nothing. So we're trying to get the message across here, is the point. The valleys will split open like wax before the fire, like waters poured down a steep place. All this is for the transgression. What's transgression mean? Sin. When you see transgression, you can just substitute that word sin in there and see if the context changes at all. It doesn't in most cases. All this is for the sin of Jacob. So is it literally the person, the individual named Jacob? No, it's talking about whom? The house of Jacob, his family. But you're talking about, remember Jacob? How all of you look up to him. You revere him because you're all from him. You're related to him because of Jacob and for the sins of the house of Israel. So you have all this is for the transgression of Jacob and for the sins of the house of Israel. Anyone know what that's called? It's that two thing I keep talking about for the last year. Someone's going to have to remember. Does my wife know? Preaching for 15 years. If you have transgression of Jacob, sins of Israel, that's something. It's like each and every. Okay, I'll give you the answer. Hebrew parallelism. Okay? Y'all with me? Okay. So you're saying something one way, then you say the exact same thing using different language to emphasize a point. Don't miss it. All this is for the transgression of Jacob, that's one way, and for the sins of the house of Israel. Same meaning, different words. In the English, we have the exact same thing. If I say, each and every one of you pay attention. Each means every means each. I'm saying it twice to emphasize the point. Whenever you see that in the Hebrew, it's a very ancient way of saying, pay attention, right? And then he says the question, what's the transgression of Jacob? What's the big sin? Is it not Samaria? What's in Samaria? At this point in time in history. Well, okay. I guess that's a good answer. Oh, man. The reason why I laugh at that is because that's exactly what I would say. So my brain just like, yeah, that's true. Not Israelites at this time, but they were Israelites before the captivity, right? That's it. They had a mountain there. And in that mountain, they would sacrifice animals to Yahweh, Jehovah. The problem was that's not where God's temple was. So now you have two locations to worship God. Which one is correct? Remember in John chapter 4? Jesus at the well in Samaria, there's a woman there, and her big question when she found a prophet, the question was, where's the right place to worship? In the mountains like my forefathers say, or in Jerusalem like your people say? The answer was, it doesn't matter anymore the location of worship. It matters how you worship in spirit and in truth. So this began here, all the way back here. And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? So God's saying, what's the big sin of the southern kingdoms now? Is we have multiple locations to worship Jehovah God. One of them is correct, one of them is not. Sure, you're worshiping the right God, but not in the way He told you in the law to worship Him. That's a problem. Therefore, because of this, I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. All her carved images shall be beaten to pieces. All her wages, all the money sacrificed to God in this location, shall be burned with fire, and all her idols I will lay waste. For from the fee of a prostitute she gathered them, and to the fee of a prostitute they shall return. So it's not just Jehovah God being worshipped here in Samaria. What else is being worshipped there? Carved images, idols, a little bit of everything. Whenever you see the word prostitution used here, it's a very polite way in the English to say it. It's a bit harsher in the Hebrew. I'm not going to use those words because we're good civilized people, but the idea is there that you are prostituting yourself out to these false gods, these idols. And because of that, you're charging the people that come to worship these so-called gods to sleep with these prostitutes of the temple, to worship a certain god. Ashtoreth would be the one in view here. Later on, she's kind of known as Aphrodite, right? The goddess of love, of spring, of rebirth, of renewal. And so if you want Aphrodite's or Ashtoreth's approval, you sleep with her priestesses to be able to bring about that new life, is the idea. So he's saying that's a problem. Verse 8, for this I will lament and wail, I will go stripped and naked, I will make lamentation like the jackals and mourning like the ostriches. Now, again, remember, I mentioned before, whenever you see animals talked about in the Hebrew here, some are a bit unclear. Meaning we don't really know what animal per se they're describing here, but the description of them is someone in mourning. I've never seen an ostrich mourn personally, but I guess they're sentimental is the idea. Because her wound is incurable, and it has come to Judah, it has reached to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. So what's the big bad sin in chapter 1 that Micah is trying to wake them up to? Worshipping idols. That seems to be a common theme, right? Hosea, that's the whole issue. Because of their idolatrous worship services, the Lord said, don't sacrifice to me anymore. I don't want to see you in my temple. I don't care what you have to offer because the way you're living is not reflective of you worshiping me and me alone. There's a problem with inequality, with the justice system. Everything that you're doing, your behavior does not model the type of people that I redeemed from Egypt. So, same thing here in Micah. He's looking at Jerusalem, looking at Judah, and saying, there's a problem here. Things may be okay for right now, but there's something coming. You need to be prepared for it. Okay, questions, comments?
The wound being incurable, to me, is talking about, you can see with the worship of idolatry, the wound. But what is underneath is even worse. It's an incurable wound has infection down deep inside.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Is the Lord saying that there's no way of hope for them?
But he brings out the fact by using the word incurable. Wound has gotten so bad, things have gotten so bad with the idol worship. Now it has to be destroyed and broken down and replaced. Some wounds are curable, some aren't curable. So this is so bad, it's just got to be taken care of.
Yeah. All right. Verse 10. Tell it not, or don't tell it, in Gath. Where was Gath? One of the main cities of the Philistine nation. Right? Remember? The Philistines, they had their major cities. There were 5 of them. One of them were Gath. So what he's saying here is, don't tell the people of the Philistines how bad it is. They've been in combat forever between the Philistines and the Israelites. I mean, that's the entire book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That's their big bad enemy until Assyria shows up. Weep not at all in Bel-Ephra. Roll yourselves in the dust. What does that indicate? Covering yourself with ashes? Mourning. Right. You should be totally disturbed by the fact that the Lord has to wake you up to your idolatry being a problem. Pass on your way, inhabitants of Shephir. In nakedness and shame, and the inhabitants of Zanan, do not come out. The lamentation, Beth Ezel, shall take away from you its standing place. For the inhabitants of Marath wait anxiously for good, because disaster has come down from the Lord to the gate of Jerusalem. Harness the steeds to the chariots, inhabitants of Lachish, in the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. For in you were found the transgressions of Israel. The idea here of talking about these nations that are surrounding Jerusalem, the infection, if you will, that wound that was there in Samaria and in Jerusalem has spread outward, is the idea. Therefore, you shall give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. The houses of Achbiz shall be a deceitful thing to the kings of Israel. I will again bring a conqueror to you. Inhabitants of Mareshah, the glory of Israel, shall come to Adullam. Make yourselves bald and cut off your hair, because the children of your delight. Make yourselves as bald as the eagle, for they shall go from you into exile. The implication here is that the next generation is going to suffer because of the actions of them. Now, does the sin of the fathers go on to the children?
Sometimes consequences continue, affect anyway.
Does the sin of the fathers go on to the children? All right, y'all seem pretty clear about this. The sin, the guilt of the actions of the fathers do not go on to the children. However, the consequences do. Right? If your dad or your mother was a bad person in God's eyes, does that make you bad? No, it doesn't. Not at all. We're all made in His image. We're all clean and pure at one time in our lives. When we ourselves have the free will to then rebel against God, then we bear that guilt. However, the consequences of one generation can be passed on to another. If your father was a severe alcoholic and abusive, does that sin of alcoholism affect you? It affects you because of the actions of your parents, right? The sin itself, the guilt, does not get passed on to you. So the idea here is trying to make them realize that their actions have consequences for them from God's perspective, but also the consequence of that sin affects the next generation, the children of your delight, the ones that you love, the next generation, your babies, are going to suffer because of what you're doing here.
And he's telling them that they should be so ashamed, they should shave their heads. You remember when the priest during David's time, that the enemies cut their beards off and cut their garments off, and David said, stay away until it grows back, because it's very shameful for them to be that way.
Yeah.
So he's saying you should be so ashamed that you should shave your head.
Yeah. When David found those messengers that were sent back, their heads were shaved, their beards were cut off, their clothing was torn, he said, go and hide yourselves away from the sun even until it grows back. Just one more biblical proof that wearing a beard is the most godly thing that you can do. Amen? Anyway, you see me without a beard, it's a shameful thing. I'll tell you that right now. But yes, they should be ashamed of their spiritual condition, because not only are they going to suffer, and they will, for sure, but the next generation goes to captivity, away from home, and the only thing they want to do for 70 years is go back home and remember God. The thing that they're not doing here at this time period in Micah. Okay, chapter 2, verse 1. Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. Anyone have any thoughts about that last part?
Make your bed lying.
You should make your bed every morning. That's not the meaning here, but yeah, it's you get it, right? Okay, all right. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is the power of their hand. They covet fields and seize them, and houses they take them away. They oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. If you go back and look in the book of Leviticus, I'm sure you spend so much time there, it's almost embarrassing for me to mention this. But in Leviticus, God was very concerned about people and their property, especially in the land of Canaan. The idea of you being in debt to someone, you were never allowed to use your property as kind of a payment towards someone else, because the land that was given to them all the way back in Joshua was special because that was the promised land. They were told where they could live, and their property was valued. If you were in debt, how long did you have to go before that debt was cleared officially and legally? 7 years. Every 7 years, you go bankrupt. Not in our traditional sense, but every 7 years, any debt you've got, hey, it goes back. You're being forgiven of it. That idea of equity, of justice, of being good to one another because you're brethren, your family, you're God's people. That's the issue here at stake. You're taking property that does not belong to you. Who does it belong to ultimately? God. It says, I have established you in this land. I took you from slavery. I gave you an inheritance. And you're seizing it and taking it for yourself, as if the Lord wouldn't provide for you what you needed. Okay, verse 3. Therefore, because of this, thus says the Lord, behold, against this family, the nation, I am devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk haughtily or pridefully, because it will be a time of disaster. Keeping in mind here, Hezekiah is king. It's important because historically, Hezekiah was the good king they needed in place to be able to avert this disaster. But he's trying to warn them, someone's coming. They took away the north. They're coming for you next. They didn't heed my warnings. You better. Verse 4, in that day, they, those of the disaster, shall take up a taunt song against you and moan bitterly and say, we are utterly ruined. He changes the portion of my people, how he removes it from me. To an apostate he allots our fields. The inheritance, the land, the blessings that are contained therein, they're going to be taken away from you because you're so greedy for more for yourself, everything's going to be ruined. That's the idea. Verse 5, therefore you will have none to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. When you are assembled back here, you can't figure out what land belongs to whom because that generation's dead. Do not preach. Thus they preach. One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. Do you have that in quotes in your version? Yeah? That should be a quote. What does it indicate to us? All the people are saying, don't talk about that. They preach, don't preach that way. Why? Because we're not going to be disgraceful. Look at us. We're God's people. Sure, there are other gods here to protect us too, but we're God's people. Such a thing will never happen. Don't preach that, is the idea. Should this be said, O house of Jacob, verse 7, has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? Which means if you don't think that disaster is coming upon you, then you have nothing to fear if you're someone living in the right. Right? If I say the Lord is angry with you because of your sin, you're like, well, I'm not sinful. Right? You should be good. Problem is they weren't. Right? Verse 8, but lately my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich robe off those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. You're taking strangers who are just traveling through your lands and you're robbing them too. Now, probably literally in a couple of cases, but the attitude behind it. Okay, you can trust us and we'll take all your stuff. Is their attitude of the people. All right, verse 9. The women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From their young children you take away my splendor forever. It was a special category of sinfulness to afflict women, especially in this culture, and children. There are two protected classes in the nation of Israel. Who were they? Widows, orphans. Why? Because in this culture, in this society, they were the most vulnerable. They could be preyed upon easily. If you don't have a patriarch in the family, a man leading that tribe, that clan, that family well, they could be easily influenced and taken advantage of. If you didn't have a father, no one to protect you when you're growing up, easily preyed upon, vulnerable. What they're saying here, the women you drive out from their delightful houses, they're being provided for, you took it away from them. The young children, you take away my splendor forever. The next generation you're affecting now. Arise and go, verse 10, for this is no place to rest, because of uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If a man should go about and utter wind and lies, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, he would be the preacher for this people. What does that mean? Hey, if I let you pick your own preachers, your own prophets, they want to talk about alcohol all day long. That's the God you serve. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. And then here's that little glimmer. I will gather the remnant of Israel. What's the remnant? The leftovers, right? I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. I love that little bit there, because when you see sheep together and they're quiet, something's wrong, right? You put all these people, the remnant, the leftovers of the nation of Israel, put them together, they're not going to be quiet. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through it. They pass the gate by going out by it. Their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head. What's that? Happens 3 times in Micah. Something to notice. Here's the bad news. You think you're safe, you think you're secure, you think you're being blessed by God. Here's the reality, you're not. If things don't change, you're going to go to captivity. You're going to die there, away from your homes, away from your wealth, away from your own lives. You're going to captivity. You're going to be POWs, essentially, in Assyria. But even though that's bad news, there's a little bit of good news at the end. There's something coming. There's someone coming. Now, in the book of Hebrews, you have chapter 11, which is the Hall of Fame of faith, right? And transitioning from chapter 11 to chapter 12, we then go on. Now that you know all of these people lived and did something by faith, there's this little mention at the very end of chapter 11 where it says, and the angels and even the prophets who lived before, they wanted a clearer picture of what you get to see. Who this thing, who this person was, that they all knew was coming, they didn't really know the details. Who was that person that was coming? Jesus. Who is Jesus? Son of God. He has all the authority of God, and yet he's in a physical, earthly body like all of us have. God lived among his creation for 33 years. And they all saw there's some kind of king coming, kind of like King David. And the remnant, those that are left over, those that persevere, are going to see this new nation. It's going to be strange because it's not just Jews in there anymore. All the nations will come and flood up to this mountain of the house of the Lord. And they'll learn from him and walk in his ways and tell their children about this new kingdom, whatever it is. Now we get to know it's the church. All of us. Despite our background, education level, where we're from, who our daddy was, all that stuff doesn't matter anymore because now we can go and sit with our God. See this king that they were all talking about with such reverence and awe. Look, he who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass the gate. They're now leaving their little protected area, by going out of it, their king passes on before them, Yahweh at their head. That God that knew disaster was impending upon his people, he's going to bring back and take those sheep out through the gate and lead them on their way. What does that remind you of? The Good Shepherd. I am the shepherd. You are my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I am the door. I'm the gate. And all the sheep pass through the gate. When Jesus was talking about him being the Good Shepherd, I wonder if he had this verse in mind. He's like, remember Micah, all the way back here, that book that you have read technically once? I'm the fulfillment of that, is what he was trying to say. Okay, questions, comments? Ted, you're going to need that AC on up here, buddy.
I can tell already.
Yeah. If I'm sweating, I know you're going to be up here sweating. I need to borrow your handkerchief.
It was just a great reflection to know all they had suffered and endured. There was a ray of hope
Yep.
on the horizon of someone coming to kind of make things right with all the sin and the idol worship that had transpired in that particular region.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely Micah, but most of prophets are written that way. Here's the bad news, but there's some good news too, right? And when it comes to our preaching to the world today, we have some bad news for a lot of people. Now, you're living in sin. You've been blinded by the God of this age. You think it's all about you and your happiness and your identity. The bad news is you don't matter as much as you think you do. But here's some good news. You matter enough that God died for you, right? So we always have that little good news at the end, the gospel, literally, to share with people. And they were doing it back here. It wasn't the same thing we've got, but it's very, very similar. Okay, chapter 3, verse 1. I think we got 2 more minutes. So, and I said, hear, you heads of Jacob, the leaders, and the rulers of the house of Israel. It's almost like he said the same thing twice in different ways, right? What's that called? Hebrew parallelism. Man, I'm finally... There's a couple of things I want you to know. Just as a Bible student, as someone who spends your time in Scripture, and for the longest time I read it, I'm like, that's so redundant, it's so redundant, so redundant. Why does he always do that? And then I learned, that's how they emphasized a point. And of course, God knew what he was doing through the writings of the time in which he was working, but just a little clue for you to help you when you read it. If you're wondering why it's so long-winded and so redundant, that's why. He's trying to drive this point home. Is it not for you to know justice? Whenever God asks a question, by the way, it's never for a lack of knowledge, right? That's the old line. God knows everything, so why is he asking questions? It's not to get information he doesn't already know. It's to make the people realize the information they should know, right? Remember in Acts, different book. Remember in Genesis, Adam ate from that tree because he was right next to Eve when she did it, and he was hiding himself from the Lord because he was naked. What does the Lord call out? Adam, where are you? Did God not know where Adam was? He knew where Adam was. Did Adam know where he was? Adam, where are you? You're supposed to be right here, next to me. I made you, and you were good. I gave you free will. Where are you, Adam? Oh, I'm hiding, Lord. Why are you hiding from God? Well, I'm naked. Who told you that? You were innocent, and you were pure, and you were my creation, and now you're hiding from me because you're ashamed. What'd you do? Right? Same thing here. Is it not for you to know justice? You're supposed to know what justice is because I'm your God. I'm just. I'm the just one. You have a sense of justice internally because you're made in my image. I'm just. Shouldn't you know justice? Don't you know me? Is the real question. All right, we're going to pause here for the day. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. We're rolling through Micah here. We've got a couple more prophets. There are 12 in total. We've covered 4 already. We're in the middle of 5, so we're making our way through it. If you're discouraged because of Hosea being so long, that's the longest of the minor prophets. right? So we're going to be rolling through it. It's not going to be doom and gloom forever because you have a couple of prophets here that have some pretty important questions. Habakkuk, for example, he says, how can you be a just God if you're using an evil nation to punish your people? That's the entire book of Habakkuk. God says, don't worry, they'll get their just desserts too, is the answer. So we have different questions we're going to be answering along the way. The better we know this, the better we understand our Savior, because he quotes them and is the fulfillment of them as well. So anyway, hopefully you're getting something from this class. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. We'll be dismissed now for about 20 minutes before worship begins.